Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, Tim Baker and I are tackling 10 questions regarding early retirement. We discuss sources of income in retirement, handling market volatility when no longer working, health insurance coverage options, timing to draw on Social Security, and much more. And to supplement this week's episode, we have a free resource for you to download: Retirement Roadblocks, Identifying and Managing 10 Common Risks. Because here's the reality: when planning for retirement or early retirement, as we'll discuss on today's show, so much attention is given to the accumulation phase, growing your assets. But what doesn't get a lot of press is how to turn those assets into a retirement paycheck. And when building a plan to deploy your assets during retirement, it's important to consider various risks to either mitigate or avoid altogether. And that's what this free resource and guide is all about. It's available for you to download at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement risks. Again, yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement risks. Now, before we get started with the show, I want to let you know about our next YFP webinar coming up on October 7th at 9 p.m. Eastern, Aliquot Investing, Small Investments in Big Real Estate Investing. This free webinar, led by YFP Real Estate Investing podcast co-hosts Nate Hedrick and David Bright, explores how syndications fit into a well-rounded real estate investment strategy, especially for busy pharmacists who don't have time to source, vet, and manage real estate investments. In this webinar, David and Nate will be joined by Alex Cartwright, PhD, an economist who has also led syndication projects, including one in which both David and Nate have invested themselves. You can learn more about this webinar and register at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/syndication. Again, yourfinancialpharmacist.com/syndication. All right, let's get started with today's show. Tim Baker, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, good to be back. How's it going, Tim?
It is going well. I'm excited. This week, we're talking about early retirement, which is something that I keep hearing more and more pharmacists expressing as a goal. And so, Tim, I'm curious to hear from you before we get into the details of our discussion. Is that something you're hearing a lot of as you talk with pharmacists that are engaging with us to learn more about our services? Is early retirement coming up as a frequent goal? And what do you suppose might be driving some of that?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, there's this notion of like, I'll never be able to retire, and a lot of it's because of the student debt burden.
Mm-hmm.
I do hear on, a refrain of, I want to get to a point where I work because I want to, not because I need to. I hear that almost verbatim, a couple times a month from a prospective client.
Yeah.
So the notion of early retirement, I don't want to say it's kind of in the forefront. Obviously, we do, work with a lot of people that are interested in kind of the FIRE movement and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's this shroud maybe of student debt that it's like, how do I even overcome this? And
Mm-hmm.
in a way that puts me in a place to retire, let alone retire early. So I think those that don't have that or have kind of navigated a plan for the loans, I think there's a little bit more of like sunny skies.
Yep.
But I wouldn't say there's a lot of people that are saying like, I need to retire by, this age.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of few and far between.
Yeah. And for those that aren't familiar with the FIRE term, we've talked about it on the show before: financial independence, retire early. Lots of resources out there that folks can learn more about that. But I'm glad you mentioned, Tim, the work because I want to, not have to. That's something I hear a lot as well. And, I think for some people, they love the work that they do, and it brings them a ton of value. It brings them a sense of purpose and meaning. Perhaps others, maybe early retirement is, hey, I want to get out of the stressful environment that I'm working in. And I don't necessarily love the work that I do. But regardless of those desires, the work because I want to, not have to is a thread that I think often comes out. And within that, I typically will hear, hey, I want to have flexibility. I want to have options. So, maybe I get to a point that, hey, I'd like to work part-time, or maybe something happens, health-wise, or with a family member, or something unexpected, or it's pursuing a passion project or a hobby, whatever would be the reason that their financial plan is in a position that, whether it's something they can see or not see at this moment, that they have options if they need those options in the future.
Yeah, I think there's this misconception or like this illusion of control that we have over our
Mm. Hmm.
retirement age, which is, and I think it's something like 40%. I don't have that stat in front of me, but I think it's like 40% of people retire earlier than expected. It's usually due to
Yes.
a medical issue with themselves or a family member, or it could be something like a layoff, that
Hmm.
type of thing. So there is this illusion of like I have control. Now, there are things that you can do to help with that, and to to build, whether it's something like related to consultant, that you have that flexibility, or things like that that gives you a little bit more control. But a lot of the time we don't have that, and it's
Hmm.
kind of an illusion that we think we have.
Tim, since we're going to use the term early retirement throughout the episode, that implies that there's an accepted norm maybe of what retirement means. So
Yeah.
when you hear early retirement, that term, and throughout the discussion today, what are we referring to? What assumptions are we making? What defines early retirement?
Yeah, to your point, Tim, I don't know if there is an accepted, like when we say early retirement, this is the age that we're talking about.
Yeah.
If you look at it from like social security, early retirement as defined by social security is 62.
Hmm.
So there's really a couple ages related to social security. It's your early retirement is at 62. Your full retirement age, which is different for a lot of people, most people, is going to be 67, and then you have delayed retirement that's typically 70. So early retirement in the social security system is 62, and you can't collect a benefit before that.
Hmm.
Um, the age that I think of, like if you were to say, hey, I want to retire early, the age that I think of is 59 and a half years old. Now,
Same.
why do I think of 59 and a half years old? The
Hmm.
reason for that is all those retirement accounts, a 401k, an IRA, a Roth IRA, they'll have basically guidelines to say if you take money out before 59 and a half years old, you'll be penalized,
Hmm.
unless there's exceptions to that, but you'll be penalized by 10%. So that's typically the age that I'll use. So like if you were to say, hey Tim, I want to retire early, and I would say, well, what is that? If you say 55, then between 55 and 59 and a half years old, we have to figure out an income stream that's probably not going to come out of your 401k or your other retirement accounts. So that's what I typically will use in my brain. I think if you talk to people in the fire community and you say 50, 59 and a half, that's probably not early retirement for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the few dates or the few ages that jump out to me when we have this discussion. But I think for all intents and purposes, it's 59 and a half for me.
Yeah, I think the same thing, and I agree. I think some of the fire enthusiasts, although there's many different flavors of fire, right? But the fire enthusiasts, a lot of people might think a early retirement, late 30s, early 40s, right? Type of ages that you typically see. But I think 59 and a half, for the reason you mentioned, is what often comes up. The other one, 62, you mentioned Social Security. When could I draw Social Security? 65, Medicare, that often comes up of, hey, when
Yep.
we'll talk about health insurance. So the point being, is, as we say all the time on the show, we've got to have intentionality on, like, what's the goal, what's the purpose, why is this a goal, if it's a goal for you, and then we can start to plan around that, like what does that mean to you, is it 59, is it 54, and for what reason, and then what does that mean in terms of various savings accounts. So let's jump in. We're going to talk about 10 questions that we think are important questions to consider for folks that are thinking about early retirement. And that could be someone listening and says, hey, I know I want to early retire and I've set that date. Or it could be folks that are just thinking about this as something that they're curious about and want to learn more. As we go through these 10 questions, the intent is not that we're going to cover each one of these areas in a significant amount of depth. We'll reference other resources that we have on each one of these topics as we go throughout, but really to introduce the question and get you thinking about these different areas as it relates to early retirement. So, Tim, the first question that I think is important for folks to consider is, will I work at all during retirement? Right. And as obvious as that sounds, I think if people are thinking of very traditional retirement, it's, hey, we work for 30, 40 years and then we don't work at all. But for others, it may be that we work part-time. And pharmacists, I think, are in a unique position where they have more of the opportunity to work part-time, work as a contractor versus other professions out there. So why is this question, will I work at all during retirement, so important?
Yeah, and I think like if we're defining early retirement, I think you can even define like retirement. I think so many people in a traditional sense think of retirement as, you punch the clock the last time and then the next day you're sitting on a beach or your feet are
Right.
up somewhere and that's it, right? And a lot of people, especially in the fire movement, when they talk about financially independent, retire early, I think that's what rubs people the wrong way, is because they overlay that traditional picture of retirement into that
Mhm.
paradigm. And a lot of people are saying like, well, we are still working, we're just working on our own terms, right? So um I think for a variety of reasons, like, this question is important because I think for a lot of people, we think that retirement is the destination,
Mm.
but it's really just the next chapter in the journey, right? And so much of our for a lot of people, so much of our identity is wrapped up into our role as a pharmacist or whatever we're doing. And once that like is gone, that can be jarring for a lot of
Mhm.
people. So it's not just a monetary thing. So to me, I think this is where some life planning really gets it would be really important. Is okay, if we don't have to work, we truly don't have to work. What are we doing? Are
Mhm.
we volunteering? Are we taking care of grandkids? Are we getting into hobbies? Are we traveling? Um, there's a lot of stats that say if you work, the longer that you work, the more, the better your retirement will be in terms of like the financial planning part of it, because you're just delaying a lot of the things that work, affords you, whether that's health insurance or whether that's income, things like that. But it's also like, your social circles are often connected to your work in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, like if that goes away. So to me, this is really important to kind of, I think, look at it both from a dollars and cents perspective, Tim, but also like the social aspect of who are you post,
Yeah.
full-time pharmacist, and looking in the mirror and doing some deep digging of like, what does this actually look like? So I think it's an important question to ask.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad you mentioned, what does this look like, but how will I be spending my time? It's actually one of the other questions we had, so we'll kinda knock both of those out,
Yeah.
together, but this is one of those things that we, myself included, we have this idea of what retirement might look like. Yeah, it could be how our parents have gone through that phase, or grandparents, maybe what we see on commercials, whatever, but taking it to the next step of what does a day look like? I've heard people go through this exercise. You mentioned the life plan, which I thought was great, and having some clarity there. But going through the exercise of actually like mapping out for a month, like what would I be doing on a Monday at 11 o'clock, right? On a Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And, not that you have to get that granular per se, but the idea is a good one that right now you think about the percentage of your schedule that is occupied by work, and especially I think about folks, Tim, in our phase of life where it's work and young kids, like that's a big chunk of our time, right? And if you fast forward to a date and time where we're not working and the kids out of the house, whoa, that is a big gap of time. So what are we doing with that time? What are the goals you mentioned? Is it travel? Is it volunteering? Is it spending time with the grandkids? Like what does that rich life look like in retirement? And the second layer I would add to that, Tim, is if there's a partner, spouse, significant other involved, like what does that look like for the individual and then for the we? Jess and I were joking recently that like we love spending time together, but we also have individual things that we love to do. And
Yeah.
I very much see in retirement that we'll have things that we want to do together, whether that be volunteering or traveling or other things. And then we'll have other things where it's like she's doing her thing, I'm doing my thing. So
Yeah.
I think that discussion of what does this look like for what does this look like for we as well?
Well, and especially in retirement, as you age, like one of the things that often doesn't get talked about, and it's a risk in retirement, is loss of spouse. And a lot of it comes from the perspective of like loss of a social security check and things like that. But
Mm,
what about like, I look at my parents, love my parents, but my dad doesn't have his own interests. Like he just kind of does what my mom wants to do. So like if he were to lose my mom, like what happens, And
mm,
so I think like that's a big thing. And yeah, in the in the life planning, we go through an exercise called ideal schedule. So you go through and you say, okay, what's the ideal day from the moment you wake up, from the moment that you put your
mhm,
head on the pillow, and then what's the ideal week? So Monday through Sunday, like what are we doing? And then it goes out to the ideal year. Like, are you spending,
Mhm.
the summertime up north, or are you visiting family? Those types of things. And I think that for a lot of people, they realize how much of their day is tied into work, and then
Yeah.
once that's gone, like what happens? So
Yeah.
those are the exercises. I mean, we've talked about like the three questions, and I think those are all important things to kind of reference back to and revisit, especially as you're going through the next like phase of your
Mhm.
life. But I think really put pen to paper, and I've talked about this, I think, with you. I don't know if I've ever talked about it on the podcast, but like when I did my sabbatical, I had a month off where I did not touch work, and I kind of had a little bit of like, what am I doing?
Mhm.
Like how am I gonna like fill the day? Which sounds crazy, but like it was a struggle for me. And like I wanted to make the best use of the time, but I
Mhm.
also felt like I had some constraints here and there. But like that little window was like important for me to kind of put myself in someone's shoes who's kind of
Yeah.
going through that transition. And it sounds silly,
Mhm.
but it's not.
That's a good point, though. I've actually heard people talk about. I'm thinking back to the interview that I did on episode 291 with Dave Zagaric, who has made that transition in retirement, and he talked about redefining retirement, really thinking about it as like a halftime to kind of reassess where are we going, why are we going here, what does this look like. But I think some of those break periods, you mentioned the sabbatical, other people talk about mini retirements. I think it'd be really helpful to having some of these experiences where we get a feel for what this might look like, and what are some of the ahas of how I do want to spend my time, or what the gaps are in time. I mean, joking aside, we're just in a phase of life, both of us right now, where really sun up to sundown, it's work, kids, that's the schedule.
Yeah, I made the comment like, "Hey, we haven't like Shay and our kids haven't really hung out with you and Jess and your
Yeah.
boys in a while." And I think we just look at our schedule and it's like
Right.
soccer, football, swim. Like it's just so
Yeah.
many things that are going on. But eventually, that's going to go away, right? To your
Hmm.
point, like that's going to be in our rear mirror, and that's why I think like even couples sometimes, because they're so in their kids activities in their lives, that they almost kind of forget about each other,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
spouses. And that can be, I think there is a pretty high level of divorce and things like that as you
Mhm.
age, because you kind of lose that connection with your spouse. And I think that's important to make sure that you're continuing to kindle. So all of these things kind of play into it.
So that's our first two questions. Will I work at all during retirement? How will I be spending my time? The third question, Tim, is how will I replace my pharmacist paycheck? Again, seems like an obvious question, but for decades, we have an employer that's paying us on a monthly basis. And if we were to stop work altogether, again, that may or may not happen. But if we're to stop working, we've got to make our own paycheck at this point. So we've talked about this on the show before. We'll link to that in the show notes. But thoughts on this question of how will I replace my pharmacist paycheck?
Yeah, I don't really think a lot changes here. I think what does change a bit in terms of like the sources. I think what does change is kind of like where in early retirement, where do they come? Like, where does the money come from? So,
Hmm.
if we're retiring at 55, the the sources of your income is probably going to be from part-time employment. It could be from your traditional portfolio, but from like a brokerage account that doesn't have the 59 and a half,
Hmm.
10% penalty, which you have to build, right? So a lot of people, they're really set on their 401k and their Roth IRA and things like that, which is really important. But the third bucket, so that we have the pre-tax, after tax, the
Yeah.
third bucket is the taxable, which is going to be in an early retirement bucket. So I would say probably those are the two big things, for most people, would be part-time employment, and then like a brokerage account, or like traditional savings. um, if you're in the real estate, it could be rental income or liquidation of like a rental property. But then as you age, the things that kind of get the green light are Social Security. If you decide to collect that at 62, or you wait to 67, or even later to 70, and then getting into, once you're past 59 and a half, the traditional portfolio where you don't get that 10%
Hmm.
haircut. You can start, distributing from a 401k, an IRA, et cetera. There are other things out there like annuities. It could be a pension. If you have a
Hmm.
company or government pension, which we know aren't necessarily a thing that a lot of people have, but that's typically based on an age that you can get to that. It could be, tapping into the value of your home, things like reverse mortgages, which get a nasty reputation, or selling a business, or it could be cash value life insurance. But
Mhm.
I would say the heavy hitters here, especially early on, it's going to be part-time employment. It's going to be things like a brokerage account, savings, and then, potentially, real estate, things like that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, especially with the brokerage account, especially with real estate, there's planning that has to be done there, right, for us to be able to accrue those savings to tap into
Hmm.
those in early retirement. So, early planning, of course, really important here. And when we talk about priority of investing, this is always the one asterisk, right? Hey, if you're thinking about early retirement, you know, this sequence changes when we think about more of the traditional buckets like the 401k, 403bs, IRAs, et cetera, because of that 59 and a half restraint that you mentioned earlier. Tim, number 4 on our list is, hey, what if there's a market downturn early on in my early retirement? So I've decided to retire early. Let's say there's a market downturn and we experience some of that volatility that can be disruptive to the nest egg. Always a problem, but maybe more of a problem here if we've got a longer runway of years that we need those funds in retirement.
Yeah. So what we're talking about here is sequence risk, or sequence of returns risk, which is the potential negative impact that the order of your returns, your investment returns on your portfolio due to the market, um, is heightened, especially in the withdrawal phase.
Hmm.
So if you take, and I'll run through this. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I wanted to kind of, I feel like we've talked about sequence risk, but I haven't really talked through like a scenario. So I
Hmm.
actually did a scenario where we have one where it's favorable returns, so like double digit returns, like the second that you retire, and then one that is like negative returns.
Hmm.
So, and then what does the outcome look like at the end of, I did it for like a 10-year period. So if we start with $1 million and you have an annual withdrawal of 50,000, which is 5%, and we have we're doing this over 10 years. If we go into the first year of the favorable scenario, the first year we get a 15% return, 12% return, 8% return. Even taking out 50, and over the 10 years, it's like 4.7% in aggregate a return. At the end of the 10 years, you're going to have $1.2 million. So early on, we've got, the first, 3 years, 30 some odd percent.
Hmm.
Um, if we look at the same thing, instead of getting positive 15, we get negative 15, negative 12. That same portfolio, even over the 10 years, which is going to get a 4.7% return, is going to end with 361,000. So it's almost
Wow.
$1 million swing. So it's the
Wow.
same aggregate, 10-year,
Mhm.
return. But after the first year, for the favorable, you end with 1.085 million. After the first year, you end with 800,000.
Mhm.
So you've taken off 15% because that's basically the market downturn, but you've also withdrawn 50,000. So that's what we're talking about here with sequence of return risk, is that the timing of when you retire is probably one of the most important things related to the market.
Mhm.
So what we've always said is like flexibility here. So if the market is tanking, it might be worth to like work another year. And most of the time,
Delay
like,
part-time,
in
yeah.
this scenario, we have, 4 years, minus 15, minus 12, minus 8, minus 5. Typically the market doesn't do that. We don't have, consecutive years, maybe 2, maybe 3 of year, but like this is where, pushing that out and having flexibility of like, okay, maybe I'm not going to retire at, 53. I'm going to retire at 56, or I'm
Yeah.
going to retire at 57, that type of thing. So that to me is really important, and that speaks to the timing of the investment returns that you're getting. Now the ways to combat this is, which is really hard, is really to kind of be more conservative, take your money from, equities to bonds or even cash. But the problem with that is, nobody has like a crystal ball to say like when's the best time to do that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of sequence risk at play.
Number 5 on our list, Tim, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is what will I do for health insurance coverage? So
Yeah.
we're not yet at the age of 65. We can't necessarily put Medicare into play. We no longer have employer coverage if we're working part-time or not working at all. What options are we thinking about here? And obviously we've got to factor this in as a cost as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, unfortunately, and we've kind of bemoaned this fact being business owners, there's not a great option here.
Mhm.
I think, looking at employer sponsored Cobra coverage, but that only typically lasts 18 months, and that's really expensive because you're paying the full premium. If you have a spouse that you can ride his or her coattails, that's one way to do it. It could be private health insurance, so looking,
Mhm.
at the exchanges, things like healthcare sharing ministries, like that.
Mhm.
That might be something. I know you looked at those in the past. It could be, there are some, and I don't know if Starbucks still does this, but I remember a lot of people. I think my sister worked for Starbucks, when she was in college, just to get insurance through them. She was working part time. It could be Medicaid if you don't have assets. Like, if I would say that you probably shouldn't be retiring if that's the case, or just like short term plans that provide like
Mhm.
temporary coverage. So probably for most people, it's going to be looking at the exchanges and trying to find the best, probably catastrophic plan that they can. But unfortunately, there isn't really a great solution here to kind of bridge you before you get to 65 to get to Medicare. It's
Yeah.
it's kind of pick your poison, so to speak.
That you mentioned the Starbucks. There's actually a fire pathway, barista fire, that's named after
Yeah,
that play, right? Which is, working part-time at a place like Starbucks, or a place that has those benefits, to be able to get access to those. The other comment I'd make here, Tim, is I think while these costs are very real, like we have to put them as objectively in play as possible. What I mean by that is, like, if you've done a good job and the dollars are there, like, even if this feels scary or you don't want to spend money on it, like, if the math supports it, like, you just factor it into the plan, right? I've seen some people, I
yeah,
think, talk about this as like, oh, I've had employer coverage my whole life. I'm 3 years away from Medicare. I'm done working. I'm over it. Don't need it. Don't want to be working anymore. But I'm going to wait till I get to 65. And maybe that's the play. But if the nest egg is there, like, we just need to factor this in as an expense, and consider it. I mean, the other note and comment I'd make here, back to our discussion of early planning with something like a brokerage account, this would be another play of early planning with something like HSA contributions, where, can we be accruing and saving money in HSA throughout our career, such that one of these instances here, we're talking about early retirement, we've got some dollars that are earmarked specifically for that we don't have to necessarily draw separately from our portfolio.
that's right. Yeah, HSA would be a great bucket for this, because obviously it has the triple tax benefit, but the flexibility to be able to
Hmm.
use for, you know, now and later. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a great bucket for that.
Number 6 is, are my dependents independent? And if not, have I factored that into my planning and assumptions? Tim, lots to think about here, kids and elderly parents, but looking at dependence and cost of dependence.
Yeah, this is kind of hard too, because I always joke with my kids that they need to move out so I can turn their room into a whiskey room. And my kids are 10 and 5 or whatever. Obviously he's always younger, but I don't but I think this is hard because I think we're all trying to prepare our kids to kind of launch, right?
Mhm.
But oftentimes they come back, and we have to kind of figure out what that looks like. So you know that could be for kids managing like their college and expenses related to that. But then after, like, if they don't get a job, or if they're not
Mhm.
able to support themselves, like what are the rules around rent and things like that, and just how does that affect your overall financial plan? And then elderly parents, there's a lot of pharmacists that we work with that they say, I am my parents' retirement plan. Like, that's the thing, right?
Mhm.
And I respect that. A lot of it's like, hey, I'm a first generation immigrant. Their sacrifice to get over here, and my sacrifice is kind of making sure that they're okay, in retirement. So we have this term called the sandwich generation. It typically is, people in their 40s and 50s that are taking care of like adult children, but they're also
Yeah.
taking care of like elderly parents. That's a big thing. And again, like, I would say it kind of goes back to when we talk about like education planning. Like, you have to put your mask on first and then put
Mhm.
on the mask of your child. I don't think that ever goes away. So I think that, this can be an unexpected thing for a lot of parents, but it can really, especially like elderly plant parents, if you're the one that's kind of, you know, caring for them, and that these are often the things that kind of force it can force a retirement early for you, is that you're taking care of other people, right?
Mhm.
So I think having these conversations with, you know, your kids, with your elderly parents, and come up with a plan and kind of ground rules, I think is really important. So we can kind of include this in the plan and know, when to zig and zag.
Yeah, Tim, anytime we talk about this topic, always comes to mind conversation we had with Cameron Huddleston on the show a couple times, who wrote the book Mom and Dad We Need to Talk. And, in the context of elderly parents, this is where those conversations are
Yeah,
so important, as uncomfortable as they may be, right? Because, I'm thinking about even discussions I've had with my parents about, what does their financial position look like? What are their retirement goals? What are their desires for, staying in the home? Versus other living arrangements. What does their long term care insurance policy look like? And part of those conversations obviously is focused in a genuine care and desire of what do my parents want, but there's also a reality of like that may impact our financial plan. And that's not being selfish. Like we're just trying to be responsible. And I think, if we can get into those open conversations, we can start to plan around that a little bit to understand what the impact may or may not be of that situation with parents on our financial plan.
that's right.
Number 7, we touch on this a little bit, Tim, but when will I draw on Social Security? We talked before in episode 294 about common Social Security mistakes to avoid, and a big part of that discussion was around when we opt into starting Social Security benefits. For someone who's thinking about early retirement, and building that retirement paycheck, a Social Security benefit might be an important part of that, and the temptation perhaps could be there to start those benefits early, and just understanding what the impact of that could be versus a delayed benefit selection. So thoughts here on this question of when will I draw?
Yeah, I think a lot of financial planners are, coming around to the fact that, like, if you can delay your Social Security benefit as long as possible, the better it is for the overall plan. So, and I know this, to your point, it can be, if you're working for, or if you're retired for, you know 10 years, or whatever it is, and your funds are dwindling in some of those, brokerage accounts or savings, I think it can be tempting to draw earlier, right?
Hmm.
But I think if you look at the math, and I think this is from my Social Security statement. If you look at my Social Security statement, if I were to retire at 62, my monthly benefit would be $1,826. If I were to retire at not full Social Security age, but 65, it would be 2,290. If I then go to 67, which is my full retirement age, it goes to 2,662.
Wow.
If I delay it till age 70, so I'm getting those deferment credits, it goes to $3,306. So the spectrum of early at 62 is 1826 to delayed is
Hmm. Almost
3306.
double. Yeah.
But the big thing here, Tim, that doesn't get enough press is that it's inflation protected, which there's no other pension or annuity out there that you can get that does that. So one of the big hangups for retirees is like, I'm working on a fixed income. I'm working on a fixed income. But once, inflation takes over, as we've seen in recent years, that really, like, provides pressure
Hmm.
on, okay, how am I going to how am I going to make this, these dollars last? So that would be the thing that I would implore, people when they're looking at their, their benefit for Social Security is, if we're planning this, can we plan to at least get the full retirement age? Or,
Hmm.
can we delay it from 62 to 67 at least, to get from, an $1,800 benefit to a almost $2,700 benefit? Because this will pay you out for the rest of your life, which we don't know what that is, inflation
Hmm.
protected. And that's where you see that exponential benefit versus, if you peg it at $1,800. So it's still inflation protected, but I think you want that percent of your paycheck to be as high as possible that is covered by,
Hmm.
the Social Security and inflation. So it's a really important discussion to have.
Tim, it's a good plug and a reminder for folks, if they're not already doing this, to check out their My Social Security account at ssa.gov, just to dig into that report. What are the expected benefits? Always a good thing to build into. I typically try to check it in just once a year, kind of see what's going
Yep.
on. So Since you mentioned inflation, Tim, let's jump down to that one. And that question being, have I accounted for inflation? You mentioned Social Security being inflation protected, but really nothing else beyond that. So, if we think of inflation as of late, which has been higher than historically, although that's come down, more recently, but even the historical rate of inflation, if we're retiring, let's say in our early 50s, and we're afforded the opportunity to live into our 90s, like costs are going up, right, significantly over that time period. So the question here is, have I accounted for inflation when I'm looking at these early retirement numbers?
Yeah, and one of the best ways to account for inflation as a retirer is to be in a is have some of your assets in equities, right? Which gets scary because
Mhm.
then we talk about the sequence of return risk. But I think really for a portfolio to endure 30, 40, 50, 60 years is to make sure that you're taking, intelligent risk in the market. So, we just got news of the rate cut yesterday, and
Mhm.
immediately, you're seeing like our cash account at our custodian went from 5.1%, which is really solid, to 4.6%.
Mhm.
So savers, and often, people that have, that are in retirement, have a good amount of cash, or they should, because, they're basically taking slugs of cash out to basically build their paycheck. That's going to affect them potentially negatively. Now, you know, interest rates, and inflation, sometimes, we'll see interest rates go down, but we won't see like the cost of goods go down
Mhm.
because they're pegged at. We talked about that in previous episodes. They're kind of pegged at that high watermark. So I think it's really important, when we talk about this question is, are we accounting for inflation? I think the best way to do that in a retirement, set in is, again, as much as your dollars can come from Social Security as possible is great. But then also taking, intelligent risk in the market where, the market is kind of, performing in a way that kind of, keeps pace or
Mhm.
outpaces inflation, is what we want. So, on the so that's kind of on the asset side, but then on the debt side, just making sure that, we're efficient, there with
Mhm.
rates and where inflation is as well. So I think it's important to, um, for retirees that are potentially living on a fixed income, to account for. And a lot of people, this and really taxes, Tim, it's kind of like
Yeah.
can be a second, an afterthought.
Good point on the taxes. Probably a whole separate episode we should
Yeah,
do around like tax planning and early retirement.
yeah,
Number 9 on our list is my partner, spouse, significant other on the same page. We already talked about this in the context of, hey, what does that schedule look like? What does that ideal life, that rich life look like in retirement? And what's the I, what's the we? But I think it's also just a bigger question of like, are we on the same page with this concept of early retirement? And maybe if one spouse wants to work longer than another and one's having to draw down from their assets, like, are we good with that? Does that jive?
yeah. And I think this kind of starts with, where are we at and where are we
Yeah.
going. So, when we do this with clients, we call the first meeting get organized, where, we've plugged everything into our client portal: checking, savings, credit cards, student loans, investment accounts, value of the house, the mortgage, all the things, right?
Mhm.
And for a lot of people, it's the first time they've seen their stuff all in one spot, right? Because we bank over here, we have debt over here, we have investments over here. And then for spouses, that's also true, right? Because I don't necessarily see everything that Shay has,
Mhm.
if I'm not tuned in. So if we plug that all into one platform, we can kind of see the landscape of where we're at. And then I think from there, once we establish where we're at, we talk about where we're going. And then I think that this is some of these questions that come up is like,
Yeah.
okay, Shay, if I retire and you're still working for 10 years, like, are you cool with that? Probably
Mhm.
not. Right. So I think that's the space to have the conversation. Again, I'm biased, Tim, right? Because, we're planners, but sometimes these are hard to have with your spouse,
Yeah, that's right.
right? So having that third party, like the independent third party that has your best interest, that can ask questions,
Mhm.
um, is, I think, a safe place, so to speak, to have these conversations. Because, you know, if Shay says, "Oh, I'm going to retire early and you can keep working," I'm going to say, "Yeah, that's cool, whatever." But maybe I have some resentment about that, and I think if we're in a place where, it's safe and we can kind of talk these out and get on the same page, it's really important because, we're trying to row this boat in the same direction. And if we're just
Yeah.
you know, having these surface conversations and not really getting, into depth, then we're just kind of spinning in a circle. So
Mhm.
I think it's really important to make sure, and this goes back to life planning, to make sure that, your vision of early retirement, overlaps. It doesn't have to be the same,
Yep.
but it overlaps with your spouse or with your
Yes.
partner, to make sure that, your needs are taken care of, but also your spouse's needs are taken care of.
Yeah, what came to mind, Tim, as you were talking about is I think my parents, to their credit, have done a really good job of this. My mom's been retired now for a few years, and my dad has no plans in the near future to retire. He just loves his work. It's
Yeah.
energizing, and he acknowledges maybe that will change at some point in the future when it does, and maybe it looks part time or consulting or whatever. But they have kind of figured out, like, for them individually, my mom, has a ton of joy that she gets from just the daily rhythms and routines that she has. And it doesn't mean my dad has to be doing the same thing. So I don't think there's a right or wrong here. It's more about what works for you as a couple. And as you mentioned, having some of those conversations to avoid, or try to avoid as much as you can, some of the resentment or other feelings that might come up along the
Yep.
way. All right, our last question, number 10 on this list of 10 questions to consider for early retirement, is: am I prepared for potential long-term care expenses? Tim, we talked about Medicare already briefly, but here we're talking about some of the significant expenses that can come beyond what Medicare may cover. And specifically here, thinking about long-term care insurance. We talked about this on episode 296. We'll link to that in the show notes. Your thoughts here on: am I prepared for potential long-term care expenses?
Yeah, so I think the stat is that a person that's age 65 is going to spend $157,500 on healthcare and medical expenses, throughout the course of their life. A couple, it's 315,000. So, and this doesn't necessarily include the cost of like long-term care.
Mhm.
So when we talk about long-term care, this is really, help with kind of the daily living things. So like being able to get out of bed, move around your house, use the bathroom,
Mhm.
dress, feed yourself. But it also kind of is more like, cognitive things like being able to pay bills or, shop. So, oftentimes, and actually one of the biggest cause for like, a long-term care policy to get triggered is Alzheimer's. But
Mm.
the second biggest is arthritis, Tim, believe it or not.
Wow.
So, a lot, this is one of those things. It's like, this will never happen to me, or I don't got to worry about that, or I'll figure this out later. But it's one of those biases that we have that it often can come and bite us in the rear end. So what we talk about with long-term care is there's really two ways to prepare for this. One is to self-insure. So just like we're talking about, being able to like pay our own healthcare and things like that, this is kind of, this is not that. This is where we're basically saying we're going to forego a policy. We're basically going to, if this comes up, we're going to reach into our own pocket, into our own portfolio, and pay for the care that we need. The alternative, and what I would recommend, is purchasing a long-term care insurance policy
Mhm.
where it really affords you, access to benefits that allow you at a minimum to age in place. So these, there's studies that show that, couples are willing to spend, $2,500 to $3,000 a year on a long-term care policy. And you can get a policy that, can kind of get you a basic policy that will have, someone come in the home or things like that. I think a lot of people, when they think of long-term care, they think of like a nursing home and things like that.
Mhm.
This is really trying to, get a policy that provides benefits that can bring people into your home to assist you as you
Mhm.
age. So, there's typically a Goldilocks zone, is that you should start, so if we talk about early retirement, you should start discussing this probably in your 40s and 50s. Start really
Yeah.
assessing it in your 50s, and the kind of the sweet spot to purchase a policy is like early 60s.
Yeah.
So this is really important because, again, like the once you kind of go into like a facility, if that's the case, like that's where expenses can get really
Mhm.
astronomical. So the longer that you can stay in place and have the help that you need, the better I think it is for you from a psychological perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And again, this is one of the ones that's like, like not going to happen to me,
Yeah.
Tim, but I
Mhm.
think important look at. And I think we look at these policies as almost as like a coupon for future care. So like, hey, if I get a benefit that's $3,000 a month, but what I need is 4,000, then I'm only reaching in my pocket $1,000 to kind of cover down on the difference.
Again, episode 296, 5 key decisions for long-term care insurance. We covered that topic in depth. We'll link to that in the show notes. Tim, great stuff. And one thing I would say to our listeners, early retirement or not, we touched on a lot of areas of the financial plan. We talked about the importance of having a life plan, having the vision for where we're going, why we're going there. We talked about building a retirement paycheck. We touched on insurance and Social Security, investing priorities and decisions to make around investing, and how to prioritize different parts of the investing plan. And at YFP, this is what our team of certified financial planners and tax professionals do. We support pharmacists at every stage of their careers to take control of their finances, reach their financial goals, and build wealth through comprehensive, looking at all the different areas we discussed, fee-only financial planning and tax planning. And we'd love to have an opportunity to talk with you, to learn more about your situation, to learn more about our services, determine if there's a good fit. You can book a free discovery call with Tim by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Top of the page there, you'll see an option to book a discovery call. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. We'll catch you again next week. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of Your Financial Pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.